So I'll just read you one quote from him. People equate price with the value of their education. That's it. And he could use that then to leverage the increase in the ranks for higher education. So I would just sort of mention that. And I also want to mention too, I want to mention as well that part of the cost of this system, a huge part of the cost of this system, is being borne on the backs of our students as well as contingent faculty in the form of rising tuition and really burdensome student debt. That this exploitative labor model is being paid for by students in essence for the rest of their lives. Right? The measure of student debt, and I have all these statistics if anyone's interested in the discussion, I'll talk to you about it, but I'm sure most of you are aware that student debt is going up at alarming rates because tuition is going up at alarming rates. And obviously, because of the economic disparities that Judy talked about, it's more difficult for people to pay for college. So it becomes this perfect storm for students. And then I'll just mention as well that I imagine most of you know that the rules regarding student debt are different than any other kind of debt. And this, you cannot escape this. It will follow you to the grave. Your Social Security wages can be garnished to pay for your student debt. Your disability payments can be garnished to pay for your student debt. It is a form of predatory lending, and there's an enormous amount of money made on the fees and the reconfiguration of student debt. There's an entire industry operating here that makes it almost impossible for students ever to unburden themselves from that. And so I just wanted to sort of mention that. And I just might mention on that issue two other things on student debt. Collectively, Americans now hold more student debt than credit card debt. It's about $1 trillion. That's with a T. That's a lot of zeros. I'm not a math whiz, but that's a lot of zeros. And the other thing I might point out is that many adjunct and contingent faculty are themselves burdened with student debt as they're making the really low wages that Judy talked about as well. So I want to just talk, okay, so I want to just mention what I think are the broader implications and the broader political ramifications of the way in which this system is working. Because I think that, as Judy suggested in her talk, it affects more than the people in this room. It has, I think, a much broader implication beyond the bounds of the university. And it really speaks to what is the mission of a university, what is the purpose of education, and these, I think, are in essence political questions. So that it really speaks to, I'm trying to skip ahead. That we operate in essence under a business model of education. Earlier I was in part of the panel on private schools, and that is just a really honest way of saying this is a business, right? And we see elements of that creeping into public universities and not-for-profit private universities as well. And we move away from the value of a liberal arts education designed to promote thoughtful, engaged citizens, and instead decisions and choices are made about where resources are going. And I want to suggest that they're not driven by market forces, they're driven by people who are making decisions, which means they can change the decisions they're making, right? I don't want to end in a kind of a gloomy thing. So I want to try to say here that in many ways what's happening with contingents and academic labor has an enormous amount to do with the rise of contingent labor in all other sectors of the economy in the United States and globally as well. I think there's a lot of linkage there and a lot to learn from that. But I also want to suggest that academic labor, while sharing a lot of commonality, is also different. And I want to say that it's distinct with particular political implications, and that has to do with tenure and academic freedom. And that does make it a different kind of labor from others. And I want to suggest that academic environments have provided important sites for the elaboration of ideas that have been historically essential to the left and historically essential to progressive movements, particularly in the United States since the mid-20th century, multiculturalism being sort of a big looming example. And that without that space, which is protected by tenure and academic freedom, the left and progressive politics loses an important site in which to develop a particular kind of politics. And that seems to me to be really important as more people than ever are attending college. What is going on in those classrooms? And I want to suggest that that politics is part of the reason that we see a growing dependence on contingency, and I would say that it's very related to the politics of neoliberalism that Judy was talking about. And we have a particular historical moment where, particularly after 2008, where it becomes really easy to hide that politics behind the financial crisis and behind those financial stresses. But the trends that Judy was talking about and the trend toward contingency is decades in the making, right? You don't reach a point where 23% of the faculty are tenure track since 2008, right? It takes a really long time to have contingency be 70% of your workforce. You've been working at that for a while. Yeah, so I wanted to mention that, and obviously it speaks to some of the things that Judy mentioned as well, that it is acknowledged that part of the success of the neoliberal agenda has been its grounding in academic units and in think tanks and its capacity to shape the way we think about our politics, the way we think about our ideas, which means that that education is an inherently political act. It is inherently, it can be disruptive to the status quo. And so this is, right, becomes really important, I think, for us to think about what it is that contingent faculty, what are the political stakes, and who's bearing the cost, because it's not just us, it's students who are also bearing the cost to promote and protect this system. And so I just want to make a final point in the what I see as the political stakes of this model, and then, as promised, open it up for discussion. Because I think there is a further political point, in addition to the need, the politics of tenure and the politics of academic freedom. There's a long tradition in labor history, and particularly in US labor history, that focuses on the importance of economic independence and the politics that come out of economic independence. That if you are economically dependent, if you are economically frightened, if you operate in a space where you are economically insecure and perpetually fearful, your politics are going to reflect that condition. That economic dependence creates political timidity. It creates a politics of fear. So I'm suggesting here there's a relationship between your economic position and your political power. And so what you've got is an economically insecure faculty who are continually worried about whether or not their contract is going to be renewed. And I can assure you that that affects your teaching. It affects the decisions you make in your classroom. It affects whether or not you're going to choose controversial material or not. It affects, right, you're driven by a fear of student evaluations. You are going to accommodate your teaching to that. It adds that continual fear absolutely affects the way in which you teach. And so that, I would say, is a challenge structurally to academic freedom, right? You're not free in the classroom when your anxiety is, well, if I ask the students this question, how is that going to be reflected on my student evaluation at the end of the term, and is my contract going to be renewed? So that affects what goes on in the classroom. And I think the other issue about economic insecurity that is incredibly important is what's happening to this generation of students and the politics that are going to come out of a generation of students who are forever in debt, who come out of school with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, right? I've read a statistic, the average student debt is like between $25,000 and $30,000, right? If you're going into a labor market that looks like what